Recording in progress.
Two in G flat major, opus 90, number 3. It's essentially a song without words.
Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you all for being here this afternoon to help celebrate the life of Paul Vail. We appreciate your patience as tech did what tech sometimes does. Mary, did Paul have a sense of humor? My order of service wouldn't open until about 30 seconds ago, which includes all of the readings for today. So I'm going to say that Paul's very much in the room with us today. We welcome you into this space. We have some familiar faces. Some of you have never met each other before, and how wonderful that the life of such a loving, compassionate, and caring man brings us all together today. I am Pastor Casey Marie Pandel. I am the minister here at Summit Unitarian Universalist. If it is your first visit or your 5,000th visit, you are whole, you are holy, you are loved, and you are so welcome here. Thank you for sharing in this time of grief, of celebration, and love. Our opening words are from Patricia Sheldon, entitled Never Fully Extinguished. In this time of holy stillness, we gather to honor the life of the person we love. In this time of holy stillness, we remind ourselves that the flames of life and love are never fully extinguished. In this time of holy stillness, we offer ourselves for sharing the weight of each other's grief. In this time of holy stillness, we offer the strength of our love to help others survive their pain and their grief. In this time of holy stillness, we call forth from each of us the power we offer out of life, out of loss, and out of love. I would like to invite Paul and Mary's children up to light our chalice this morning, or one of you to light it and everyone else come up. We light this chalice, which transforms wax into pure light and warmth, to remind us of our own living, transforming the stuff of this world into the love and activity of our daily lives. As we remember Paul, may today bring forth transformation in ourselves, from grief, from healing, in memory and wholeness, and from celebration and love. And I would like to invite Grace Lewis McLaren up for our reading. It's a very special Paul story.
Good afternoon, and thank you all so much for being here. This is a piece that was taken from a longer essay by the writer Barbara Davenport, and she gave me permission to share it with you here today. It's a tribute to Paul Vail, the absolute sob mechanic, by Barbara Davenport, an absolutely satisfied customer. My 8-year relationship with Paul has been mostly a pleasure. His rates are reasonable. He's never done unnecessary work or padded a bill. He's taken the time to figure out the complex problems of an aging car, and his diagnoses have always been on target. The guy loves sobs and breeds amaryllises. What better credentials could I ask for? I need a car. I can afford to spend $5,500. That's not much, and it's not very promising on the Auto Trader. He puts both hands on his desk. Why don't I build you a car? Build, like from scratch? Start with a body. I'll supply whatever parts it needs. Take me 2 weeks tops. He flicks the ash from his Dunhill cigarette. We walk out to look at some cars. The first has no transmission. Second one is missing both doors on the driver's side and all of its seats. Engines have been removed or severely cannibalized for parts. Roofs caved in. Fenders bashed or other things totally missing. These cars aren't going anywhere. These aren't cars, these are carcasses. Build a car from scratch. Sounds like a lot more than 2 weeks. Paul starts working on the car the first week in December. He's found a very good rebuild engine with a clean turbo. He calls me with updates. All the hoses in the vacuum system are tight. No leaks on the first try. The shop gets busy. It's going to be more than 2 weeks. He calls me with the updates. Christmas comes, Christmas goes. I knew that all along. But Paul tells me he's figured out a better way to wire the dash, and he's installed a cup holder. And his voice is bright with satisfaction. The important things. January 4th, Paul calls. The car's ready. Paul has worked several nights all through, and he's finished the car, but he is so tired his face is gray and sagging. After he turns the car over to me, he says he's going to sleep for about 18 hours. And he's kind of matter of fact as he walks through the details, but the pride rings in his voice. He works the cup holder for me. Paul confided in me that he wasn't sure whether his Amaryllis business would ever make any money. But he said, if you're going to put a huge amount of time and money into a project, it better be something that, even if you don't make any money, you'll be happier and your life will be richer for it. $5,500 is a small price to pay for Paul's riches and mine, with a car thrown in. In a poem about the sculptor Giacometti, Robert Wallace wrote, "We'll stand in line all day to see one man love anything that much. Right now, I'm standing at the head of the line."
And I would like to invite Reverend Tanya Marquez out for our meditation.
Just breathe with me and allow your breath to gently caress the softness and tenderness of your heart with whatever has shown up at the moment. For all of our losses, by Patricia Sheldon. For those we miss, for things long gone, for those who, or what we last held in our arms, in our hands, and in our hearts, we pray. We pray for memories to stay strong, memories of words and warmth, of actions and stillness. We pray for love shared and lived, love to remain with us and with them, and for that to become enough. We pray for the courage to put our feet on the floor when we wake, to move through the day as we cared. Oh, love that holds us all. Hold on to me while I hold on to what I have lost. Amen.
Go ahead and roll. Go ahead and roll. Go ahead and roll. Go ahead and roll.
this room met Paul at least once. If you met Paul, raise your hand. Most of us did. Unfortunately, I didn't get the chance to meet Paul. So it's really lovely to be sitting here and hearing you all laugh with joy over these pictures, many of which you've probably never seen, hearing the awes as you're seeing him with his children as they're growing up, and it's a really beautiful testament to what he means to all of you. Paul was born in Racine, Wisconsin on May 22nd, 1962. Neil and Elda Vail were thrilled to welcome their second child, and he was welcomed into the family that included his sister Louise and Elda's extended family, parents Erna and Otto Coles, and Aunt Martha. All of this that I'm reading now are all Mary's words of her husband, and she says they all doted on him. Elda and Neil were both educators in the local school district. Because their parents were educators, Paul and Louise would spend summers traveling and working on projects with their parents. When they were little, the family would go camping all over the country. This would include long road trips, and they would often join other family friends. This is where Paul discovered his love of fishing. He also described a trip to Europe where the family picked up a Volkswagen camper in Germany to use while they were there and then shipped back to Wisconsin after the trip was over. He was around 12 at the time and did not appreciate all of the museums and castles that his parents wanted to see. He did love camping, exploring the natural spaces and the adventures he would have with kids at the local camping areas. One summer, Paul had to help his dad restore a small house that they had purchased across the street from their home for his grandparents to live in. The place was a mess and needed major renovations that they all worked on. Paul resented it at the time, though he later shared that this is where he learned that he could build and create. He said that his dad pushed him to help with the project, so he learned to build walls, paint, tile, and more, skills he would use all his life. When the Vails decided to start a family, they also looked for a faith community to raise that family in. They joined the local Olympia Brown Unitarian Universalist Church in Racine, Wisconsin, where Paul and Louise attended Sunday school, and Elda was an active volunteer. The community was very important to Paul as he became of age to join the youth group and to take part in local sleepovers called cons. He had the blessing of a tight group of youth who were his friends and ended up becoming involved in district and national events through the Liberal Religious Youth, or LRY. LRY was a youth-led organization with religiously liberal youth that was formed before the merger of the Unitarians and the Universalists. Formed in the late 1950s, this group was entirely youth-led through the 60s and 70s and into the early 80s. To the youth who were a part of this organization, it could feel utopic when they gathered. It was a place where they could be themselves with no judgment. It was not all sunshine and rainbows when Paul came of age to be in the program, though he found deep connections, some that lasted a lifetime. And he found them in those spaces, but more on that later. Paul's teenage years were challenging. During this time, he was struggling in school. With both parents being educators at his high school, there was a lot of pressure to be the perfect student. He was very smart. He loved to read books and can do complex math calculations in his head, but he did not do well in a classroom setting. He was a learn-by-doing kind of guy. He told stories of his teachers putting extra pressure on him because his dad was an administrator at the time. It got so bad that he felt like he had become an embarrassment to his father. There was a lot of tension at home, a lot of tension, and that eventually led to Paul leaving when he was 15. He never did finish high school. When Paul left home, he went to stay in the homes of his youth group friends that he knew through LRY. He couch surfed with his local area friends until he ended up in Chicago. He survived by hustling pinball games. He was an excellent player and would win multiple free games on one play and sell them one at a time to the next kid waiting for a quarter. This is how he would get enough food to buy a hot dog or other arcade food. He lived with some other youth in an abandoned hotel in downtown Chicago. This was a hangout where friends would gather and play music, and he would tell stories of one band who was a regular as they were forming and building a following. The band? Styx. Though he had some adventures that he shared from this time, most he never spoke about. Paul's LRY connections saved his life at that time when he left home. They offered him safe places to stay. They fed him and helped him as he found his way. He continued to go to cons and was part of a youth group from his area who attended a gathering at Carleton College called Common Ground. This was a week-long conference and conversation between youth, young adults, and leaders in LRY and the Unitarian Universalist community in order to help create a new youth group. This conference did not achieve the organization's goals, and another would be planned 2 summers later. This is where Paul met Mary for the first time, as she was there with her community of youth from Maine. Paul remembered Mary as the girl from Maine who played the flute. Mary remembered Paul as the boy who let the girl cover his head in tiny ponytails. They were both about 16. After the conference, Paul was elected by his peers to be in the financial office for LRY. This included housing in Boston and a paying job. Paul headed to Boston, where he lived in a cheap apartment with other LRY staff called Taco Villa. They worked in a basement office behind the UUA headquarters at 25 Beacon Street, right next to the Boston Commons. 2 years later, the second conference happened following the UUA General Assembly in Brunswick, Maine. Paul was in charge of the Youth Caucus housing at GA, and that included getting the supplies. Mary was the delegate to GA from the local Brunswick UU church. He remembered meeting her at Carleton College and asked her to help with the local shopping for the week. For the next 2 weeks of conferences, Mary and Paul would go shopping when supplies were needed, and their friendship began. Later, Paul and Mary were involved with the UU Young Adult Network, where they built community and friendships that continue to this day. Some of those friends are in the room with us and joining us on Zoom as I speak. Paul craved his freedom. When he was younger, he would ride all over town on his bike to visit friends. He even got a speeding ticket from a local officer for riding his bike too fast. Once he could drive, he found his passion for cars. His first car was his grandparents' hand-me-down, and he was hooked. When Paul and Mary started hanging out just as friends, Paul drove a hardtop Mustang. This was his fast car, and being a Midwest boy, he was all about American cars. Mary came from a Saab family. Mary and Tom Beer, who was also a Saab owner, convinced him to buy his first Saab from Mary's mom, Grace. Shortly after he bought that Saab 99, it blew a timing chain. Paul reached out to Mary's uncles, who were mechanics who specialized in Saabs, and they coached him through that first major repair, including pulling the engine and the transmission. Paul, working on the street during a Boston winter, then proceeded to repair the car. He was hooked on Saabs from that point on. It was then that he began to offer repair services in Boston. He rented a garage in the back of a church up the street from his apartment and made flyers to place on local Saabs to get customers, and began his business. This was the beginning of Absolute Saab. When Grace sold the car to Paul, she was moving to California, and she told him, "You take care of my daughter," as she would be far away. Mary was dropped off at college in Providence, Rhode Island to study pastry arts as Mom and her new husband, John, headed off to California. Paul lived in Boston and was only about an hour's drive away, so he came to visit on weekends and would drive Mary up to Maine to see her dad, who was also named Paul, on breaks. Their friendship deepened, though they were still not yet dating. Mary was clueless to the fact that Paul was interested in her as a partner, and he finally asked her on a date to see the B-52s around Halloween of 1983. This was their first date, and at the end, Paul said that he wanted to marry her. Mary kind of laughed, as they'd only had one date. A year later, he proposed, and of course, Mary said yes. They were married on August 24th, 1985, at the Olympia Brown UU Church in Racine, Wisconsin. After Mary graduated from college, they moved to Boulder, Colorado to begin their life together. Because Paul had started his Saab business in Boston, they had a lot of stuff to move. But rather than renting a moving truck, heaven forbid, they bought a modified school bus with a lifted ceiling that was painted baby blue, especially for the move. And they loaded it up with all of their belongings. This included their 2 cats who hid in the bus, only coming out for food as they drove to Boulder. This was the first of many adventurous road trips for the 2 of them, a practice that they continued throughout their time together. When they arrived in Boulder, Paul and Mary only had $20 left to their names on to lease a shop. They lived in the shop and used the money to purchase materials to make flyers to advertise Paul's Saab service. They would then drive around local public parking areas and malls looking for Saabs to put the flyers on. Smart. Soon he had customers and some income enough to get started. Mary began her pastry work as well, and all was well until the oil industry tanked and business dried up in the late 80s. That then led to several moves that eventually led to Encinitas, California in 1987. This is where Absolute Saab got its name, as Paul figured out that the AB beginning would get him top listing in the Yellow Pages, and therefore the first call of all Saab owners. And Encinitas, Paul began repairing cars in the garage of their duplex apartment and got customers using the flyer on cars method once again. If it still works, don't fix it. He got too big for the space and began renting various spaces in town until the warehouse on C Street with a house for the family to live across the parking lot. But more on that later. The shop was there for many years, and they planned to purchase it and had the first right of refusal on the lease. Unfortunately, the property owners worked with a local developer to craft a sale that was so complex that Paul couldn't replicate the terms in the time allotted once the planned sale was revealed. This was a huge heartbreak for Paul, and he began the search for their place in Ramona, the Saab Ranch. Paul had a very loyal and dedicated customer base. He had the natural ability to connect with his customers, and they would come back time and time again with their next Saab, as Saab people do. He would build relationships with them, and then when asked, would share advice beyond Saabs. Advice that he had learned over the years in his school of hard knocks. He had some of the same customers for years, and many became good friends. He was so grateful to be able to do what he did and really did enjoy sharing stories and helping folks when they asked. Paul was unsure about being a parent, and Mary knew that she wanted to be one. When they moved to California, Mary's brother Will, about 3 or 4 years old at the time, was someone that Paul and Mary would take on outings to the park, to the beach, to the zoo, to Disneyland. Paul built his confidence in his potential fatherhood by practicing with Will. When Will was old enough to drive, Paul and Mary were around when that time came, and Paul was the one who taught him to drive stick on an old Saab that he had fixed up especially for him. Paul and Mary would go to Will's concerts when he became a professional musician any time he was in the area. Will said that Paul was his younger and cooler dad growing up. In October of 1992, Sean was born. Paul was reluctantly present at the birth and kind of hid behind Mary's shoulders while the labor progressed until the baby was born. Mary remembers the wonder in Paul's eyes when he first saw Sean. And from that point on, Paul was a dedicated and loving father. He loved being a dad. Because Sean was born near Barry's birthday, Paul was hoping the next baby would be born by his birthday. 5 years later, Anya was born, a few days ahead of his birthday. When Anya was just beginning to crawl, Paul got the lease on the house next to the shop on C Street, and the family moved in. This allowed Paul to be near his children as they grew up, and the kids would go over to the shop and help Dad. And he got to enjoy all of the subtle changes that happened every day as the children grew. The kids got the benefit of both parents being around as Mary was home during the week, and Paul would be with the kids on the weekend when Mary was working her various businesses. Mary was in a terrible car accident in May of 2000, and this caused both of their lives to upend as she could no longer even hold her children. Paul shifted into a greater caretaker role as Mary had spinal surgery for injuries caused by the accident. It was a 2-year process that caused so many changes in Mary's body that they thought children were no longer a possibility. In early 2002, Mary noticed her emotions were all over the place, so she took a pregnancy test. Surprise! She remembers the huge grin on Paul's face when she told him. They were both thrilled to welcome Colin into their family the fall of that year. Colin was such a blessing, and having a baby to care for was so healing after all that they had been through. Being dad to his kids was one of Paul's greatest joys and sometimes challenges as he worked to be the best dad that he possibly could be. He was incredibly proud of each of them and was looking forward to becoming a grandpa someday. His children will share some of their own reflections with you in just a little while. Almost exactly a year ago, Paul and Mary had the opportunity to help out a friend in need of a temporary place to stay. Valerie and her daughter Azriel came to stay for a week with them, and Paul felt like a grandpa for just the week. They stayed in touch, and Paul always wanted to hear about Azriel's latest adventures. She and her mom drove out from Connecticut just to be here today. Paul's love for fishing became a family love for boating and camping when the kids were young before Mary's accident. They would go to the river or Lake Powell, often with his sister Louise and her boyfriend Terry, or a group of friends that enjoyed camping together. His first boat was a tiny inflatable raft. Over the years, he had several boats and was in the process of restoring his pride and joy, Just Add Water, a cabin cruiser that he had plans to take Colin out on as he hadn't been to the river yet. Unfortunately, that didn't get to happen. The Vails moved to Ramona in 2007 to a 5-acre ranch property when Paul could restore sobs and create his gardens. They were in the process of building a barn when the witch fire almost burned it all down. After the fire, they all worked to get the place cleaned up and to recover from the damaging loss. It was a devastating time, but Mary and Paul worked as a team to recover once again. In 2011, Paul started having some health issues. He was at a poker game with his longtime poker buddies when he passed out. After multiple doctor's visits, he found out that he had been born with a congenital heart defect, a bicuspid heart valve. He had severe stenosis, and it had to be replaced ASAP, or he would not survive. Paul was terrified to have such a major surgery, so Mary was his healthcare partner, in the process dealing with all of the details. His valve was replaced with the understanding that he would need a new one in 10 to 15 years. After recovery, he was feeling more like himself and returned to gardening and sobs. In 2018, Paul's mom, Elda, came to live with them. She had some significant health issues and couldn't live independently anymore, so Paul worked with his sister to get her settled at his home in Ramona. Paul and Mary cared for her until she died of natural causes in 2022. It was a precious time for Paul and his mom as they rebuilt the bond that had been lost when he left home. Paul and his sister also talked or texted frequently during that time and became closer as well. After Elda passed away and all of the kids had moved out, Paul and Mary had some time for themselves. They started to go on road trips together once again. Paul loved the redwoods, so they drove up to all of his favorite spots. Prairie Creek State Park and Jedediah Smith State Park, where there were the old growth trees. The picture on the cover of your order of service today is of Paul and his last sob that he and Mary had taken on just one such trip. On their last trip in July, they drove up the Oregon coast. Paul was having a hard time and kept telling Mary that his back was bothering him. He wanted to go down to the beach and look at the tide pools, but they couldn't find a place that had easy access on the rocky coast. So he enjoyed the sunset and the beauty of the trees instead. In August, just before their 38th anniversary, Paul told Mary that he was feeling breathless, and she immediately took him to the ER and asked them to check his heart. The replacement valve was barely moving, and they started the process of preparing to replace it. Before they could perform the surgery, the old valve threw clots, and he had a stroke in front of Mary, who recognized what was happening and immediately called for assistance. Unfortunately, the stroke was quite large, and they spent a week trying to save him. He was intubated and couldn't speak, but he could hear Mary and the kids when they were there to visit him. When they took out the tube for a few hours to see if he was strong enough to breathe on his own, the first thing he said to Mary was, "I love you." And the second thing, "Where are my kids?" Only Sean was there at the time. They hugged him and talked until he was tired and then went home so that he could get some rest. Shortly after they left, Paul began to struggle with his breathing again, and the tube was replaced. Mary never left his bedside again. 2 days later, the doctor said that his brain had stopped working and that he was gone. Paul and Colin had gone to the DMV together a few years earlier. Paul had signed up to be an organ donor. When the medical team shared this with the family, it gave them all comfort to know that he would continue to help people after his passing. Paul was building a butterfly habitat in the backyard last summer in the final weeks of his life. Providing habitat for and raising butterflies was a lifelong spiritual practice for him, and it all began when he brought home a few monarch caterpillars from a field of wild milkweed near his home when he was a little boy. His mom took him to a local monarch gathering where they worked with scientists to tag monarchs with tiny tags to see where they ended up. Paul made the local paper with one of his butterflies that was tagged and found in South America. It was much further than they had ever tracked a flight before. He continued to raise butterflies by planting their feeder foods and exploring habitat his whole life. When they had children, Paul would fill fish tanks at home and at the children's preschool with anise swallowtail caterpillars and wild anise so that they could watch the life cycle from tiny larvae to winged wonders. You could see the childlike wonder in his eyes as he would gently place a newly hatched butterfly on a child's hand, and they carefully watched it pump its wings and get ready for its first flight. It was magical. Mary is comforted by the garden that she and Anya have been maintaining up at the ranch. All of the flowers on his cactuses, the orchids, the lilies were all in bloom the week he passed, as if to show their love for him. One of the cactuses even bloomed on Mary's birthday, out of season, as if Paul was sending his love. As many of you in this room here and on Zoom today know, Paul was a friend to many, a loving son and brother, a caring father, and a beloved life partner to Mary. He left us all too soon and is deeply missed. As he was passing, Mary told him that she would look for him in the garden as the hummingbirds gathered at his feeders and the butterflies munched on the many varieties of milkweed. She assures me that his presence is felt there every day. And now we'll go into a time of sharing where each of Paul's children will come up and share a little bit about their time and their life and experience with him, starting with Sean.
Hey everybody. I'm really happy to see so many people turn out here to celebrate my father's life and share their memories of him. I know he'd be thankful and grateful to see each and every one of you. There's a lot of stories I'd like to share about my dad today, but I want to take my time here to really focus on the overall impact he had on me as I was growing up and how he shaped who I am today. So my father, at his core, was a problem solver. He is especially obvious in his work with sobs, but it extended to all aspects of his life. Whenever there's a problem, he would exhaust every possible way he could to fix it before you call anybody to ever do it for him. That was his last resort. But I don't think he realized, for me, as a child and as a teenager growing up, the impact seeing him solve these problems had on me. I realized that as I was growing up, seeing him solve all these issues and problems and create all these contraptions to make things more efficient made me realize that my ability to solve problems and create things was only limited by how much energy and time I was willing to commit to learning. He managed to build an almost 40-year career out of fixing cars, started his own business without so much as a high school diploma, and he earned the respect of his customers and peers because he was willing to put himself through the complicated and tedious process of thinking through a problem, investigating it, deducing the causes, and figuring how to fix it. This fact about my father has always been incredibly inspiring to me. And, excuse me. Because it made me believe that if I was passionate enough about developing my own skills and knowledge, that I too could be a man that could overcome any challenge that life throws my way. Seeing this at such a young age, thank you. Seeing this at such a young age gave me an image of strength to aspire towards that I still believe in to this day, and I'm so grateful for that example he set. But I would be doing his memory a disservice if I didn't also point out that he showed me that time and time again, being smart, skilled, knowledgeable in one's craft is not enough. He was also very humble and yet confident in his approach to talking with people. My father spoke to his customers on sobs, as an expert on sobs, but also as a friend. Like someone they didn't have to be anxious about talking to. He always did his best not to make people feel dumb or out of their depth when he was trying to explain something complicated to them. He walked this very delicate balancing act of being confident yet humble at the same time. And he was not always successful at it, but he was very good at it when he wanted to be. When I started my career as a software engineer, I found that part of my job would be explaining complicated things to people that didn't understand them. And finding that balance between being humble yet showing confidence at the same time was difficult. So I thought to myself in those situations, how would my dad explain this to them? These are just some of the many examples and lessons my father taught me growing up. But in addition to all the incredible things he taught me, he was just such an incredible father to have growing up. I remember him helping me Yeah. I remember him helping me to learn to play with my first video games when I was barely old enough to hold the controller. I remember the countless family fishing trips, even a couple of just the two of us up to Wyoming. I remember the most awful jokes and general silliness that it came so naturally from him, which is a tradition I try to carry on. As my wife will tell you, those memories are so incredibly valuable to me, and I'm so thankful for them. He worked so hard and overcame so many challenges in his life to get to where he was, and to give me and my siblings an amazing childhood to grow up in. He was my father and my best friend, and I am so honored and grateful to be his son.
Lorena?
Hello, everyone. I'm Lorena, Sean's wife. Fun fact, me and Dad, we share the same birthday, May 22nd. Now I'm going to have to celebrate for the both of us. I'm trying to find what I made here. Oh, yeah, there it is. I would like to share with you my favorite memory with Dad. When Sean brought me to meet his parents, I was still brand new to this country. I was very nervous about it, as I was still improving my English. I got to their house. We had a very nice dinner he made. And then he asked me, what was the dessert he made? I tried, and I could not believe it. It was a traditional Brazilian, by the way, I'm from Brazil. It was a traditional Brazilian dessert called quindim. I guessed, of course, because I knew what it was. He told me he looked up online a Brazilian dessert to make it for me. That made my heart so warm, and I felt so welcome and respected. And I'll never forget that.
Colin, would you? Okay. I'm not going to toggle away on my iPad lest it disappears again. Colin's words about Paul. I thought I would tell a story that shows who my dad was to me and how he helped build who I am today. A huge part of my relationship with my father was based around cars. I showed an interest when I turned 16 and got my license. He taught me small repairs on my first car, and it grew from there to the point where I was doing all of the repairs on my car by choice. The story I want to tell is based on replacing a starter on a first-generation 2002 Saab 9.3. For those of you who may have gone through this procedure, to be honest, almost anything on a Saab is a pain in the ass to fix. On a Monday night, my dad and I, of course, left the major repair to the last minute. I think it was something like 3 days prior on a Friday that I drove to an O'Reilly's the day of, and my car wouldn't start after I got back from the store. So we had it towed. And then I said, hey, Dad, can I use the shop to replace my starter? And he said, nah, my feet hurt too much to do it tonight. Can we do it tomorrow? The next day, hey, Dad, can we replace my starter tonight? And Dad says, nah, I got really into this movie and I don't want to get up. Which was a very understandable excuse, by the way. So things ended up on the last day. I started to repair it around 8 p.m., and Dad tells me, okay, Colin, this repair is pretty straightforward. First, disconnect the battery, then remove this one screw from the top of the engine, then jack the car up, remove an engine support, and then there's one screw holding the starter from the bottom and two connected to the wires into the starter. Two of those are easy. One's a royal pain in the ass. Then you put the new starter in, hook everything back up, and you're good to go. Should take about 2 hours. As optimistic about this repair as I felt, I then spent the next hour only trying to get the starter's first 3 screws off the engine block. The first time you do a repair, it always takes twice the amount of time. I remember I always left calling my dad as the last result because I felt a sense of shame calling him. I always thought, I'm the son of a mechanic. My father figured out how to do all this at my age on his own. I can figure it out too. But 60 minutes on 3 screws and one just won't budge really drains you. I call my dad and I tell him, I've tried everything. I am so sick of this single screw that keeps slipping. It will not come out. After troubleshooting for 15 minutes, my dad finally says, I'm coming up there to give it a try. After a couple of minutes of my dad trying to disconnect the single screw that I've spent hours on, he said, wow, never seen that before. When you hear that from someone who's been working on the same car for 30 years, you know it's pretty bad. But something I loved about my dad is that he knew how to fix anything, even when everything is in its power to be against you. So my dad ends up cutting the wire and then splicing a new connection to the starter with a new bolt and a wire to the starter, while in the most uncomfortable angle possible under a car engine. He finishes up and says, yeah, I'm never going to do that again. At this point, it's midnight, and we've both been exhausted. I have to wake up the next morning at 8 to get back to Orange County in time for class. I finally finish putting everything in my car and go to turn the key to see if I did everything right. I open the door, turn the key in the ignition, and nothing. No sound, no starter noise, nothing. My fried brain, after working on this car for the past day, was devastated. I call my dad in a panic. Dad, I just put everything back together. The car isn't starting. I'm going to miss class tomorrow. This is why we should have done it sooner. My life is falling apart. Wait, I didn't plug the battery back in. I hung up the phone, hooked the battery back up, and the car started right back up. I was euphoric. I walk back down to the house and say to my dad, I fixed the stupid-ass machine, all is well. And Dad says, yeah, super fast fix, huh? Good job. I'm glad you were able to figure it out. You should probably go to bed now. This was one of the last things I did with my dad in August. But I know that as hopeless as I may feel fixing a car without him now, that I still have that part of him in me that is able to figure something out on my own with enough time and ambition. I am eternally grateful that even though fixing my car wasn't the most riveting experience at all times, I was glad that I got to spend that time with him. Thank you, Colin. Anya.
Do you want to just hold it? Hi, everyone. My name is Anya. I am Mary and Paul's middle child. I'm joined up here with my spouse, Isaac. He is here to support me as I share a little bit of how my dad affected my life. My dad was so excited when I was born. I was born 2 days before my dad's birthday, so it was an extra special gift to him that year. I was his one and only little girl, his wispy, blonde-haired and blue-eyed little lady. My dad loved all of his children deeply, but he had an extra special fondness for his little Peanut, which is what he called me. As I grew up, I realized that my dad and I were quite alike. We were both stubborn, loyal, and very clever individuals. He definitely had a major part in teaching me how to be that way. He and Mary raised me to be an adventurous eater and always try new things. Paul taught me to love eating clams and oysters, artichoke and bratwurst, and mushrooms at a very young age. This gave me the foundation to be open-minded to food and other aspects of my life. We also made the connection that my style and Paul's have been very similar in the last few years. This is actually one of his button-ups right here. Great minds think alike anyway. Another thing Dad and I enjoyed was spending time in his garden. At my childhood home in Encinitas, my dad built a spectacular garden that, as a little girl, I would spend hours exploring and playing in. He would be working on his automatic sprinkler system, and I would be digging in the mud, collecting roly-polies and making fairy houses out of wood chips and fallen leaves. Paul put a ton of work into creating a special greenhouse to grow a variety of amaryllises, flowers all around the year. I was so curious about his work that I would follow him around and ask if he needed me to help with any small tasks around the projects in his garden. I remember he had me help by having me stand by the amaryllises and use my height to measure how tall they grew. This made for a pretty cute picture, too. I also learned about the life cycle of butterflies in my dad's garden. He taught me how to observe and respect the little caterpillars in our garden as they munched on milkweed and inched their way across the garden. Dad would look out for the caterpillars once they reached the chrysalis state. If we found a chrysalis fallen on the ground, he would tie a little tiny thread around the top of it and rehung it in a safer place. I got to see that not every caterpillar made its way through to becoming a butterfly, but my dad did everything he could to lead the process with a gentle hand. My dad taught me to always care for the little life in our gardens. When we had to move in 2007, I was so sad to leave our garden in Encinitas. Once we started living in Ramona, a lot of things changed. As I grew older, I started spending less time with my dad. My teenage years were particularly hard for my dad because he couldn't understand where his little girl had gone. I was too focused on spending time with my friends and crafting projects, and he was prioritizing his business at the time. It took me time to appreciate our house in Ramona, but it took me even longer to realize how far my dad and I drifted apart. I started losing interests that I had in my younger years, and with that, I was also losing a part of myself without realizing it. I no longer had the same connection I used to have with my father. At the time, I felt like he was too busy with work and mad that I couldn't stop growing up without him. I was no longer the same little girl that he wanted to keep seeing me as. And And I didn't want to be that for him anymore. Our relationship had to change. In my adult years, I slowly started talking with my dad again. I learned to communicate better with him with the help of dad jokes and puns. We bonded over that really well. I moved in with my husband, Isaac, about mid-2019. And once the 2020 pandemic hit, I had to take a long break from visiting my parents. Slowly but surely, I was able to start visiting them more often once Mary and Paul were comfortable with it. Every other week, I would try to visit and maybe help my parents around the household. My dad would often be too busy to spend direct time with me during this time. In 2023, I learned that my dad had been working on a side business of growing and propagating cactus plants to sell to plant nurseries. Early that summer, I was between jobs at the time, and he reached out to me to ask if I could help him with this project. Although it was hard to match our schedules, we made the time to create a plan to spread out the cactus work over a few weekends. Our first steps were cleaning up his office garden and then mixing the perfect soil blend. Then the next step was to fill the pots and prepare for the cactus transplants. Before we could get to this third step, we had to pause for a few weekends when the sun started beaming down too hard over the garden. Dad planned to hang a shade cover over our office garden area, and it took him a few weekends to have the energy and time to get it done. Throughout that summer, Paul had to postpone our work days whenever his back was flaring up. Little did I know that Dad was actually having a lot more health issues than he was telling us. Our work days kept getting put off over and over until we ran out of time. One night when I was visiting, my mom and Dad were getting ready to head off to the hospital. I tried talking playfully with my dad, doing my best to keep him occupied while Mom was finishing up doing important tasks around the house. He thought it was really important that I went and opened up a gift that he got for me from Comic-Con and saved. He got me a gold-dipped gnome statue that was flipping the bird. He was happy to hear that I loved it. That was the last time that I got to talk to my dad normally. After Mom and Dad left for the hospital, it wasn't too long until after that our family had no choice but to let him go. Everything happened so fast, and the time our family was expecting to have with Paul in our lives got cut so short until it was gone. Hold on. Last paragraph. Thank you. I felt so frustrated with myself that I couldn't have started on that last project with my dad sooner. I felt so angry that Dad couldn't deal with his health issues sooner. But in the end, the whole family was just shocked. Losing my dad so soon has been a heavy trauma to hold, and it's not something that will fade anytime soon. I have found that the best way for me to process this heartbreak is to spend time cleaning up my dad's gardens. Oh, shoot, where was I? Thank you. There it is. I started caring for the milkweed plants, and then I got the weeds and dead palm fronds cleaned up, and then I finally got back to the cactus project. My dad left a lot of unfinished work behind, but also a lot of beauty in his home in Ramona. After my dad's passing, my husband and I decided to move in with Mary. That way Isaac and I would be able to support Mary and would get to spend more time, and I would get to spend more time caring for my dad's garden. So that's where we are now. The lessons that my dad gave me will always be a part of my life, and it's something that I will never forget. Thank you for hearing my story.
Isn't it amazing how different each of those stories were, and yet the same through line in all of them: perseverance and joy and love and compassion. Each one of these stories have the children learning really important lessons, and those are the things that we get to hear and carry with us as a way that we keep Paul alive in our hearts. Some words from Victoria Weinstein. There is no need to end our relationship with the dead, for they are still ours to struggle with, to learn from, and to love. There is no timeline for grieving them, and there is no finitude to loving them. Through time, as long a time as it takes, we take their dreams and their desires and their issues, and we integrate them into our own. We make use of whatever hard-won wisdom they were lucky enough to gain while they lived. We continue to forgive them if forgiveness is called for. We continue the work of their hands. For those of you who are seated, underneath the seats in front of you, there should be some hymnals. The teal hymnal with the soft cover. If you all rise in mind, body, or spirit to join us for singing Paul's favorite hymn, I believe it's 1046, Blue Boat Home. Anya, is it 1046 or is it 1064? 1064? I could very well have typed it wrong. 1064. Sorry about that, folks. Let me be seated. Before we depart this afternoon, Paul's wife Mary, his children Sean, Anya, Colin, and Lorena, his sister Louise, and her party Terry would like to remind everyone that we are all invited to a reception just outside these doors behind us. It's an informal reception to continue with the celebration of Paul's life. And then afterwards, if you would like, there's another informal reception with, I believe, tacos and beer up at the ranch in Ramona. And so all are welcome at both of those events. And the directions are on the back of your order of service. So if you didn't get an order of service, make sure you get one today. Thank you, Mary. I would be lost without you. We know that when we come together in these places, that it's a balance of the difficult with the love that we hold. So I encourage you, as you've heard these stories from Paul's family today, I know there are many, many more stories in here just dying to be told. There is plenty of time all the rest of today, and we want to hear them. But as you leave this place today, the next time you see a cactus or a butterfly, think of Paul. All the things he came through to be here, to get to know and love and be a blessing to all of you. Brenda, could I get you to extinguish our chalice, please? Thank you. You're the closest person. That wasn't family. As we extinguish our chalice, let us remember Paul. While the flame of our chalice has a briefness as sudden as life, it also burns with a warmth and a clarity of a life well loved, a life well lived, as we all know Paul's was. The end of our flame does not mean the end of our chalice, and nor does it mean the end of Paul's time on earth. It does mean the end of Paul's time. For we carry him with us in our hearts and our memories, just keeping him close, just beyond the veil of our lives. We remember that grief is the price that we pay for love, and it is a price we will gladly pay to have loved so completely. Amen, shalom, salam, ashe, namaste, and blessed be. After our closing song, go now in peace. May the light within you be a blessing to the world.
I'm going to play a piece called Eden by Hani Arani, who's a Polish composer. In Hebrew, Eden stands for a place of pleasure, and as a noun, it connotes a place or state of great happiness and unspoiled wilderness.
you.